Have you ever had that I'm in over my head and they're going to find out feeling? Talking about imposter feelings is a start, but you can't share your way out of imposter syndrome.
Where you worry that your success isn't real or that you've just been lucky. One study suggests that up to 70% of the population experiences imposter syndrome at some point in their career.
Imposter syndrome is created in childhood when our parents deny our authentic self. They do this by shaming us and shaming that authentic self because they're trying to control us into becoming what they want. When a person is experiencing imposter syndrome, they're having a massive shame attack. We're experiencing what is called carried shame.
Imposter syndrome doesn't care about the truth. It doesn't matter whether you have the title, whether you have years of experience, whether everybody around you is telling you how amazing you are. The reality is, imposter syndrome, in fact, it's even more likely to crop up the more evidence you have around you of how great and how deserving you are. It doesn't care about the fact it's only interested in reminding you and making you feel like a fraud.
Welcome to the Imposter Syndrome Summit for June 18th. We are finally on the last day of the summit, and I think that I did save the best for last. Today's speaker is an exciting speaker who's going to be talking to us from a point of view that we haven't heard before. Basically, lawyers and the legal community and imposter syndrome. And we'll also be talking about a bit about race and imposter syndrome. How does that factor in? In case you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, please make sure that you do. There is a study that shows that about 80% of people who watch YouTube videos don't usually subscribe. They just watch and go. But we need your support so that we can continue to give this personal development message a heads up to everybody. We need people to learn more about themselves, how they can be better, and we need your support. So please make sure you subscribe, like, comment, ask a question, share so that the message can spread. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our speaker for the day. Her name is Caroline Flanagan. She is the Imposter Syndrome Coach for lawyers. A woman of color from a working class background, Caroline learned how to succeed in a white, male, middle class world by making imposter syndrome her strength. She is a Magic Circle trained former finance lawyer, a certified coach, an international keynote speaker, host of the Legal Imposters Podcast, and author of Be the First, People of Color, Imposter Syndrome, and the Struggle to Succeed in a White World. This is a book that was a finalist, Business Book Awards Finalist for 2022. Caroline's mission is to increase diversity and inclusion in law by supporting minority individuals to know their value, contribute more of who they are, and fulfill their true potential. She is also a proud mother of 4 boys. So, Caroline, welcome. So excited to have you on.
Thank you, Mary. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for such a beautiful introduction.
You're welcome. I hope I didn't leave anything out, or if there's anything you would like to add.
I think you included absolutely everything. I was listening out for the mother of 4 boys, and you even included that, so I'm delighted.
No, I am a mother of 2 girls, so they might be my in-laws soon. So I don't want to leave that out at all. So it's really exciting to have you and to have a mother who is dealing in this topic. That also means a lot to me. So I'll go on to the very first question. Tell us your story on how you have experienced imposter syndrome and if you managed to beat it.
Yes, thank you, Mary. So my story in a nutshell is that I have experienced imposter syndrome since as long as I can remember. I want to say since the age of 6, because at the point at which I really understood what imposter syndrome was, how it was different to normal, everyday, I want to say, self-doubt, that was many, many years later. But when I understood that it meant the feeling like a fraud, that your success is going to run out at any minute, or your success rather is down to luck, and that luck would run out, and that any minute now you might be tapped on the shoulder and exposed. When I heard that definition, it took me all the way back to a very young age, Mary, where I was 6, I was at an all-white boarding school, the only Black pupil in the whole school, and those feelings, that was the first time I experienced that. And it's a feeling that continued, it followed me, pursued me, it was ever present all through my education and into the legal profession, the corridors of the big law firms that I walked through and the meetings I attended. But there was a very important shift that happened between the early days of experiencing imposter syndrome, when it felt like it held me back, to later on when I really started to understand my imposter syndrome. And what I discovered was not, Mary, that I needed to beat it, that it was something I had to overcome or get rid of in order to succeed, but that I could make it my strength and I could be succeeding almost because of my imposter syndrome rather than in spite of it.
I think that that's an amazing distinction, because I actually have a program called the Imposter Advantage. And I do get many people asking, what, you can do that? It can be an advantage. So I guess my next question then would obviously be, how do you make imposter syndrome your advantage according to you?
So I'll tell you what I did in making it sort of my strength or advantage, as you like to call it, is it started with getting a really deep understanding of where those feelings were coming from. Like, why? I started asking myself, why do I feel like this? Despite, if I look at my CV or I look on paper, despite what appeared to be like a very successful career, successful trajectory, why was I having those feelings? And it was that inquiry, that curiosity over, well, you know, what is it that makes me feel like I don't belong? Because that's what the feeling was, right? I shouldn't be here. I don't belong in this room. And so that inquiry led me to understand actually that the key to, or the real catalyst for my imposter syndrome was my difference, and my difference in a specific environment. So being the only Black people in an all-white school, or being the only person of color in a meeting, being one of a handful of Black students at Cambridge University, where I also went at the time, also being from a very different socioeconomic background to a lot of my peers when I was growing up, going to university and starting work. And what that understanding gave me was this insight. It was like a little window into the possibility that, wow, you know, if I'm in a room and there are 99 people the same, with the same point of view, with the same experience, I'm the unique person. I can offer such a unique perspective. I've got experiences to draw upon that nobody else in the room has, if I'm the one that's different, that's had this different background or is from a different culture. And I started to see the value in that. And I think in this day and age where increasingly we're seeing not just the value, but the importance of diversity, of diverse voices, opinions, experiences, the value that adds to the room. How fantastic to be one of those people in the room which had such a different viewpoint to offer. So that was really key, was understanding that there was value in my difference. And then the other one was like what it took me, Mary, to actually, you know, if you think I rose to a place in the legal profession where I was working at the top legal law firms globally, and so I worked at 2 of those. And, you know, if you're coming from a different background, a different experience, you didn't have a lot of the privileges that my peers had, for example, what that said about me, that was incredibly empowering. It said how determined I was, how resilient I was with the obstacles that I'd had to overcome to get there, how resourceful I had been over the years. And those traits, those qualities are so powerful, so useful when you're looking at going forward and future success. So it was those 2 elements, the diverse viewpoint that I had to bring, plus what having imposter syndrome and succeeding, like in the context of being different in a room, succeeding in a different way, what that said about me, that's what started to give me this feeling of, well, feeling quite empowered, feeling I have so much to offer, feeling emboldened and strengthened by it.
It is true, because your diversity, your difference brings your different voice and your
Yes.
different viewpoint to the table. I think that that's an amazing way to look at it. Um, you work with lawyers who are facing imposter syndrome. What are the unique factors that lawyers face that expose them to imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so I would say it's not so much that the factors are completely unique to lawyers. However, what I will say is that there are a lot of factors that are very accentuated, very prominent in the legal profession. So where you're working in a competitive environment, you're surrounded by other high performers, where there's a lot of pressure to perform at the highest level. It's a high stakes profession. You know, if mistakes are made, there are often quite big consequences. Then because of those high stakes, that competition, the feeling of I shouldn't be here, or I don't deserve my success, as you look around you and it appears like everybody else knows what they're doing. Everybody else is very confident. Everybody else is achieving at the highest level. That environment really does, it's like fertile ground for feeling like that strong self-doubt that we call imposter syndrome, that's all about identity and whether you should be in the room. So I think the environment that stimulates, that provokes a feeling of imposter syndrome, it for sure appears in other industries, but in the legal profession it's even more accentuated. That's what I would say.
Well, speaking of, the differences, obviously race and race relations play a role in whether a person of color feels like they fit in or not. So what struggles do people of color face that may lead them to imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and this is what's so fascinating for me. So we know, and of course your watchers, your subscribers, your listeners, Mary, will know that imposter syndrome is very much an internal feeling, an internal experience. You feel it in your body. It's the thoughts in your brain about who you are and how you're showing up. And the fascinating thing about when you look at it from a very cultural perspective, and you look at people of color, for example, in a very white world, which is what I wrote about in Be the First in the book, is it's not just internal. So you've got the internal battle of self-doubt and should I be here? But what you see and what people of color experience is that doubt around whether they should be in the room, the suggestion that their success is down to luck, that is mirrored back to them. And sometimes that's very explicit. It might be in the form of microaggressions, such as sort of commenting on, it might be like commenting on your hair, or asking you to dress a different way, or asking you to speak more clearly if you have an accent, for example. That type of microaggression that can feel, it sends the message to a person of color who's surrounded by a majority of white, for example, a majority of white lawyers in a lot of the firms that I work in. It can feel like suddenly the imposter syndrome isn't just internal, it's actually externally mirrored back to, it's reinforced by those other people's behavior, and also by how much of a struggle it is to, or it can feel like, to get ahead. Where are the role models of color? If you're a junior lawyer, mid-level lawyer, and you're looking up aspirationally, where are the people that look like you? All of that can feed the message like, well, what are you doing here? You are here by luck. Your background was different, for example. So I'd say it's that compounding effect of being in an environment where the message that you receive from other people outside of you is that your, inverted quotes, a fraud, your success is down to luck.
Well, it's one thing to be a person of color, but to be a woman of color as well, I think that that's a double whammy. You're a woman and you're a person of color. So, has it been your experience that imposter syndrome may run deeper in women of color compared to men of color, or even people of other different races in general?
Yeah, so I will say it's for sure that, I mentioned compounding effects, all these different messages or the different reasons or ways in which you can feel like you don't belong. So already the person of color, we've addressed that element. But of course, if you're a woman in a very male environment, then that can be sending messages to you about whether you belong or whether you're lucky to be there. So of course, you add those two elements together, and it's going to be compounded, that feeling. What I do want to say, and I feel like this is really important, is not every woman who's a person of color necessarily has imposter syndrome. I think it's really important to recognize that for some people that may not be their experience. However, obviously I work with a lot of women of color. I know that certainly in my community, in my audience, there are lots of women of color who experience that, and it feels like a double bind. It's the battle against being the minority culturally and the battle against being the minority from a gender perspective. So yes, very prevalent.
I'm going to ask you a question I've asked other speakers because it is quite a debate that I've seen online. I see some people saying, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome, because then you're telling them to internalize it. And like it's their problem, it's their fault, they're not getting ahead. If they just became more confident, then we wouldn't have less women in boardrooms, in leadership, things like that. So who has more imposter syndrome, in your opinion? Is it men? Is it women?
I don't think I can answer that question. I don't think there's a survey that's been done deeply enough to properly say for sure. It's definitely women, it's definitely men. Here's what I will add from my experience. So I deliver a lot of, you said in my bio, I'm an international keynote speaker. I deliver a lot of talks, particularly in the legal industry, but also in other more financial services industries. And here's what happens, Mary. I would tend to quite often send out a pre-keynote survey. I want to know about my audience. I want to know what's on their mind, what their biggest struggles are. And in the questions where I ask, do you have awareness of imposter syndrome? Do you feel like you've experienced it or it's held you back? I see quite an interesting balance between the genders. And by here, I'm talking, this has tended to be in the past where it's been people identifying as male or female, and there's been some other as well. I just want to be clear about that. But it roughly equates to about 40% to 60% in my survey, which is anonymous, by the way, 40 to 60% men and women. Then what happens? I arrive to deliver a keynote. So I'm in the room and I look out on the audience, and what do I see? A room full of women, with perhaps a few men scattered through the audience. What does that suggest? It suggests that it's the majority of people who suffer from imposter syndrome are women. Does that mean that men don't experience imposter syndrome? Well, we can't say. Remember, imposter syndrome is internal largely. We don't go around with, I have imposter syndrome, I doubt my place in this room, I feel like a fraud. Most people don't wear that on their sleeve, and certainly lots of men don't necessarily want to wear that on their sleeve. And that's clear by the fact that an anonymous survey will reveal lots of people who identify as male who say they've experienced imposter syndrome, but then actually in person, when it comes to being seen and visibly owning up to, if we like, having imposter syndrome, we don't see very men speaking up at all. But it's very important to not be seduced by what we see in the room, and attending events like this, perhaps, or being live in the audience, not be confused by that, to think that men don't suffer from it at all. Men are human too.
That's true. I think it's the aspect of shame that it's carried. One of the speakers was Kenny Wise, and he was saying there's that aspect of shame that imposter syndrome brings. So many people don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have an understanding as to why people hide it. Because, it's like you said, it's not something you have written on you. But what is your opinion on why people hide it? Is it that they don't know they have it? Are they actively trying to hide the imposter syndrome? What do you think?
So I hear the word shame. I can hear that would be, especially if I think about the environments in which I work, where with the legal environment and the pressure to perform, how competitive it is. So for sure, I can see how shame would play into it. But honestly, I think this, if we go back to exactly what imposter syndrome is, it is the fear of being found out. So if we remember that the actual definition of it points us to the fact that we don't want to be found out. So it's not at all surprising, is it, that we are secretive about our imposter syndrome? And actually, I feel my confidence in speaking about it is because I've learned to make it my strength, because I've done my work personally, internally, and now I'm the example of what's possible when you have imposter syndrome. You can go on to succeed. That gives me the confidence to talk about it to the world. But not everybody has that. Not everybody is doing that. Most people are actually getting on with their day job, trying to stay afloat, trying to manage all the demands on their time, the demanding standards, and the often unforgiving conditions in which they work. So to come out and be vulnerable, we need safety in order to be vulnerable about how we're feeling and our self-doubt. And often that doesn't exist for a lot of people. And therefore, why on earth would you, if the whole point of it is you have a fear of being found out?
We need safety to talk about it. I think that even in places of work, that is something that could be fostered. Have you seen in law firms, since you're in the legal world, have you seen companies taking charge to try and create safe spaces? And if not, what advice would you give institutions in order for them to create safe spaces for people to come forward if they have imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so I have a lot. I mean, I would say every one of my law firm clients that I go and I will deliver an imposter syndrome keynote or talk, or it may be a workshop or a session. Every one of my clients who invites me in to talk about it, one of the drivers behind that is to create a safe environment. And I consider that my number one job when I'm standing in a room and I'm talking about this is, and anyone who's been to my talks will hear I share a lot of very personal stories. I'm vulnerable on stage, so I create an environment of trust and safety, which allows people to be more open. I will say that's often of course, an isolated moment, right? It might be for the duration of a keynote or the duration of a training. So it doesn't necessarily translate into when people are sitting at their desk doing their day job. So yes, I'm seeing law firms, which I speak most confidently about, creating that safety. But at the moment, it's possibly still pockets of safety. And for the most part, people are having to kind of go on as normal and kind of brave their way through it. One thing I will say to answer the question about, or what do you recommend or suggest? One of the most effective things I have seen, Mary, is where we get more people in senior roles sharing their experience of imposter syndrome, whether in the past, a point in their journey to where they are. Really, really important. So validating for those who are coming up behind them, those who are looking up and thinking, well, could that be me? I don't know, if I already feel I don't belong in this room, how could I possibly see myself in a higher room? If you have senior leaders talking openly about their own experience, their own struggles with imposter syndrome, it's just going to create, again, that safety. It normalizes it. And that's the key. Like, can we normalize the experience of being in a very competitive environment and feeling like a fraud? Like, why not? Feeling your success might be down to luck. If we can normalize that, then it doesn't have to feel like or become such a stigma or something to feel so much shame about. So that would be one of my key recommendations.
So mentorship, especially if you have moved past it or you have moved ahead despite it, to mentor the ones who are coming after.
Yeah, fantastic. Mentorship, even better. But I want to offer to those people who aren't in a place where they feel they want to mentor or are able to mentor, don't think that you cannot still support those who are coming up by just being open about your own journey. So mentorship is fantastic. Definitely, we want more of that. But I think the conversation where it actually seeps into the culture of an organization, that we talk about the moments when we are less than 100% confident, when we question our right to be here. That's something we do. We recognize our humanity. Like, that's really important. We don't all have to be mentors in order to achieve that, although the mentorship is fantastic.
Well, I want to say to anybody who's watching, whether you're watching live or on the replay, once again, just a quick reminder, subscribe to the channel. And by the way, make sure you check out our first comment and our description for this video, because you'll be able to get as much information as possible on Caroline Flanagan, her programs, how to get to her website, her books. So make sure you check that out. Don't just watch the video and go. There's a lot more of resource that you can be able to get from her. And my next question is very personal to me. I started my personal development journey after I had my second child. And I was struggling with imposter syndrome. I did not know that that's what it was. I had found myself burning out of my corporate career in operations and logistics that I had done for about 14 years. And so I was tired, I was confused, I had no support, and I decided to step aside from work. And I started searching myself. And one of the things that I realized was a turning point was motherhood. So my question to you is, you have authored 2 books, Be the First and Baby Proof Your Career. So does motherhood trigger imposter syndrome because it does affect confidence? Or what happens when a person becomes a mother? Is it that you start to look at the world differently? What is your opinion on motherhood, careers, imposter syndrome?
Well, I'll answer the easy question first, which is, do we start to see the world differently? 100%. So you know that, obviously, as mother of 2 daughters, I certainly know that as the mother of 4 sons. For sure, it's life-changing motherhood. So when I wrote Baby Proof Your Career, one of the reasons why I wrote it was because of how it was my experience initially as well. When my first son was born, Dylan, he's now 20, which is unbelievable. But what I was seeing over and over again was very, very accomplished, very talented, very clever, successful female lawyers who were on this career trajectory, and then they had their first child and their confidence started to go down. And a little bit like we were talking about being a person of color and having it mirrored back to your imposter syndrome mirrored back to you. Again, also for a lot of women that I worked with, both as a lawyer and then later becoming a coach, what I was seeing is the sort of effect on their confidence of having children. I'll talk about where I think that comes from in a moment. But that declining confidence, again, that is mirrored, the self-doubt or the doubt about whether you're good enough, you should be there, is mirrored by the environment in which you work. So I'm talking specifically about the law, and certainly like when I was having my first 2 children, still working as a lawyer, very male, very white, and all the men who were working really long hours, they were doing all the networking late at night with clients and doing all of the things that are typical markers for progressing your career and getting ahead. Those were things I couldn't do because I was going home to collect my child from nursery, and I was the one that was up half the night feeding, and I was the primary caregiver. I was the one that, if the child needed a doctor's appointment, all of that stuff, I was the one that had to take time away from the office, from my desk, to do all of that. And that was expected, right? And the fact that that was expected and also seen by my male peers and a lot of your audience who are women who are mothers will have experienced this, the perception is, oh, therefore you can't do the job anymore. You can't be a mother and do the job. So that messaging, for sure, Mary, can really, if you didn't have imposter syndrome before having a baby, it can really start to creep in afterwards when you realize you can't compete in those very specific ways that are hours intensive, late nights, or meetings at times when you need to be there with your child. So that for sure. As for the confidence, I think there's also internally, my experience for sure was I was always very ambitious. I wouldn't describe myself as a control freak, but I definitely felt like I had control over a lot of things. I had worked my way up to this profession. I worked really hard. Before you have a dependent, a child, a small human being to raise that has other ideas to you, you think you're in control of your life. And then what happens? Right. And I'm guessing you're nodding here, Mary, right? Because you know this. When this small human being comes into the world, and I mean, already when you're pregnant, you lose that control over your body, right? Like nature does its thing, with or without you. You know, the belly's growing, the baby's growing. And I think that sense of something, there's this whole world that you can't control, you can influence, you can direct and guide, but you've lost a lot of control. And that I've seen, and was my experience of really affecting my confidence as someone who, you know, I would just decide I wanted to achieve a goal and I'd go out and I'd go for it and I'd work as hard as I needed to. It certainly complicated things. So those two elements I think at play, the loss of confidence because of the loss of control, and then the mirroring back, the messaging from an environment where those people who are getting ahead are the ones that are late in the office, or, you know, schmoozing with clients, for example, at a time when you can't, if you're or it's harder. I don't want to say you can't, because I think there are some women that do, but it's certainly a lot harder when you've got a small person at home that needs feeding.
It's true. The loss of control, I completely agree with it.
Well,
yeah, it is quite a challenge. But I think that's what makes us special as women, because we somehow manage to exist in this new world order where you're no longer controlling everything, but somehow you are.
Yeah. And I would even say it's more than exist. You know, I think it's like a superpower being a mother and continuing to work. And I love, and it's one of the reasons why I wrote Baby Proof Your Career, because the message there was about, you know, you absolutely 100% can succeed in your career and have a family. I wanted to really challenge the perception that you couldn't have both, couldn't have it all. That used to be a really common debate back in the day. Like, can you have it all? Can you have the family and the career? And I wanted to give women who it was an important part of who they were, right? And I'm guessing that was your experience. It used to be like, it's part of who you are as a working, ambitious woman, to not have to feel you have to let go of that, but find new expression of that going forward.
In your book, you say imposter syndrome wreaks havoc on your mental health. What are some of the examples of this?
So I'd say in the worst case scenario, you mentioned burnout. Is that right? Like working really hard and the risk of burnout. So I categorize the sort of way in which imposter syndrome, the symptoms, the way it shows up, as going into 4 categories. So overworking, overthinking, playing small. And that means sort of hiding behind like the hard work and the long hours, but not being visible. And then self-sabotage, which is where you're like, every time you make progress, you're the one that undermine yourself. So those 4, I call them the 4 horsemen, those 4 different ways or categories of ways in which imposter syndrome shows up. Now, the mental health side of it, the way in which it can really wreak havoc, is around the overworking and the overthinking. So the overworking, a great example of that is perfectionism, Mary. I'm sure you've heard a lot of people talk about that. It's a very common trait or symptom of somebody who has imposter syndrome, because it's that feeling that it needs to be perfect in order to be good enough, right? And the problem is, if you feel something needs to be perfect and you're driven to work and work and work to make it perfect, most likely, because achieving perfection is not actually a state at which we ever arrive. It doesn't actually exist. You don't arrive at perfect. That constant striving for it, need to make everything perfect, is physically very challenging and exhausting in terms of the effect on you physically in your body, but also then very mentally very demanding and very exhausting, because what's happening while you're working really hard is you're continuously questioning, should I be here? You're feeling anxious about getting it wrong. You're feeling stressed about not being good enough. So there's two sides to it. There's the physical toll that it takes, striving for perfection to not be found out, which is what when we look at imposter syndrome, the real driver is the fear. Remember I said that? It's the fear of being found out. That's what drives you to feel you want to make everything perfect. If it's perfect, no one will know, right? The physical toll of that. And then the anxiety and stress of trying to sustain that level of activity while still questioning and feeling I'm going to be found out.
Tell us about your coaching programs, your books, where to get them, and how people can get to work with you.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So I have 2 coaching programs. One of them is Imposter Syndrome Coaching, and I'd say that's the more general program for people. I like to describe my best client on that program as somebody who they're tired of holding themselves back. So they know they have imposter, or they have a feeling they have imposter, that they're the ones that are getting in their own way, and they're ready to change that. They want to fulfill the potential. And I do want to say this, and I'll tell you about the other program in a minute. One of the things, again, that fascinates me about imposter syndrome is in the same person that has all this self-doubt and fear of being found out, there's often this yearning, this inner, I want to say, knowing that they're capable of more. They want more, and there's an awareness of the fact that I'm the one holding myself back. So imposter syndrome coaching is absolutely perfect for that person. And what we do is we work on those 4 areas in which you hold yourself back. So overworking, overthinking, playing small, and self-sabotage. We work towards helping you be more visible, for example, so that you counteract that desire to pay small. So that's one of them. And then the other program is specifically for lawyers of color, ethnic minority lawyers, and it's called Be the First. You mentioned my second book, Be the First, and that's very much a model for that program. And that's about really the same objective, progressing your career. So as a lawyer, progressing your legal career, but doing so from a place of recognizing you're not the only one in the room. So those thoughts you have about your environment not being diverse enough, not inclusive enough, the challenges you face or experience to your, what feels like to your authenticity, and also any of the microaggressions or racism that you encounter, while that may still be a very real truth in your external environment, what I teach you is how to transcend that, how to recognize, step away from being the victim in the room of the only one, and everybody else needs to change, and until everybody else changes, I can't succeed, to being, oh, you're the first, you're the trailblazer, you are the one that's made it this far. Let's talk about, and I'm coming full circle here, when I talked about turning it into a strength for me, let's talk about what it required of you to get here, what that says about you, what you have to offer in the room with your diverse experience, your diverse opinion, and it elevates you to a place where that's where your confidence then comes from. And we work on all of those career progression elements, like building strategic relationships, being more visible, and building your personal brand. We do that in Be the First. So imposter syndrome coaching and Be the First, which is more specifically for people of color in the legal industry.
I love it. What have you done to get here, and how can you be the trailblazer on your next journey? I really, really love it.
Yeah.
So yesterday, our speaker was Humaira Sayed, and she's also an author, and she has a question for you. What is the first small yet significant step people can take to move from having an imposter mentality?
The first step, I would say, it is understanding that you're not alone. Okay, now understanding doesn't feel or sound necessarily like a step, but if you put yourself in a room where imposter syndrome is talked about, where there are solutions offered, practical steps offered for dealing with imposter syndrome, like that's like the first step, is to actually have that willingness to acknowledge it in yourself. Sounds really simple, but I come across a lot of people who are they're very much observers of imposter syndrome. And going back to that word you mentioned, Mary, of shame, there's like almost a distancing from it. And what I want to offer you is that for me, the biggest transformation I made was when I went from, why do I feel like this? This feels horrible. I'm holding myself back. I don't know what to do about it. How can I get rid of it? When I went from that to, oh, that collection of messy feelings, it has a name. It's just imposter syndrome. It's a thing. Lots of people have it. And just that awareness made such a difference, because the way my brain works was like, so if it's a real thing and it's got a name and I'm not the only one, then that means there's help I can get out there, or I can find a solution. There's a solution out there and all I have to do is figure it out, or put myself in a room with the right people who are going to help me do that. So that understanding piece is the first most immediate step. What I will add, if you're already there, right? So some of your listeners, Mary, will be like, well, actually, I already know I have imposter syndrome, so what do I do next? So what I would invite you to do, I have on my website, Mary, there's a free download. It's called, it's just gone out of my mind now. It's called The Secret Signs of Imposter. There you go. The Secret Signs of Imposter Syndrome Every Lawyer Should Know. Now, it does reference lawyers, but a lot of those signs are very common to lots of other industries, lots of people. I would recommend you download that free guide, and you'll see lots of examples of the symptoms, the ways very specifically that imposter syndrome is showing up for you in your work. And I've divided it into those 4 categories that I mentioned earlier. And the beauty of that is when you get specific, and this is what I would encourage you to do. So we have these lovely, very open and often vulnerable conversations about imposter syndrome at quite a theoretical level. What I want to invite you to do is then get really specific. How is it showing up for me? Is it when I'm writing emails and I'm completely rewording them? I'm spending 20 minutes on a really simple 2-line email because I'm afraid there's a mistake in there that's going to expose me, yeah? Or is it because whenever there's a project or an opportunity and I know I'm qualified, but I'm the last person to put my hand out? So get really specific about the ways in which imposter syndrome is showing up in your work. And then the next stage is solve one of those challenges at a time. But yes, definitely download. That's a very practical step. Download the free guide, The Secret Signs of Imposter Syndrome. And that's really going to help you to focus on the next practical step that you need to take.
For those of you watching, it's definitely going to be in the description and also in the first comment. So make sure you check that out. And now to my final question for the summit.
Wow.
To be on my last speaker. So my question is, if you could talk to your past self, maybe when you were beginning your career, maybe when you were going to law school, go back to that young lady with a big dream and with ambition. What is the one thing that you know now about imposter syndrome that you think you would have benefited from knowing back then?
Yeah, 100% it is nothing's gone wrong. That expression, nothing's gone wrong. To be in the thick of working really hard to achieve a goal, or even just be in the thick of doing your studying every day, showing up to your classes or your lectures, showing up to meetings in a competitive environment. When you have a wave of imposter syndrome come over you, a wave of fear, and I talk a lot about experiencing it in your body. So when you're experiencing that knot of anxiety in the pit of your stomach, or you're hearing the voice in your head saying you shouldn't be here, you're going to be found out, your luck is definitely going to run out. The first and most important thing I want you to go to, and what I would have said to my younger self really early on, is when that feeling happens, nothing's gone wrong. Because often we double bind ourselves with the panic, like, why am I feeling like this? Why can't I just get rid of this feeling? Why can't it be easy for me and just feel, why can't I be more confident? We cause ourselves so much more pain and anxiety and stress by challenging, by resisting how we're feeling. But that expression, nothing's gone wrong, is one of the most calming thoughts. Well, it's a thought in your brain. I want you to have that. It's one of the most calming thoughts I've discovered, and it's been part of my transformation. Nothing's gone wrong. I'm just feeling this in my body. This is just my imposter syndrome being triggered by the fact that I am stepping out of my comfort zone, or it's being triggered by the fact that I'm putting myself in rooms with other high achievers. The way I'm feeling is quite normal. And it's amazing how immediately, physically, that will calm your nervous system down already and give you a little bit more clarity to start thinking. So I would say to my younger self, remember, when that happens, nothing has gone wrong.
Nothing has gone wrong. I think that we can conclude that. Is there anything you would like to add on the subject matter?
No, I think we've covered so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. As always, I love talking about all things imposter syndrome.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm really, really humbled that you agreed to continue on with your work. Every single one of you is going to be, like I said, in the comment section and in the description for this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So to everybody else, if you're watching on the replay, please make sure that you comment replay. If you have other questions, feel free. We can still address them within the mindsetwithmary.com platform. So don't go away with questions. If you're catching this being the last interview for the summit, please make sure you check out all the other interviews. We had amazing 12 speakers, and there is a post-summit imposter syndrome workshop that is limited seats. So make sure you get on board with that. The link will also be in the first comment and in the description. Once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.